Whereas the petrodollar was based on the US offering the Gulf countries security in exchange for selling their oil in US dollars, it is now China that is offering the Gulf countries security in exchange for selling their oil in yuan. In the 1970s, where most oil was bought by the US, now most oil is being bought by China and Asia. Now let's see if I can get to that conclusion by the end of this post. So this post relates to the petrodollar and the petroyuan. Basically, in the 1970s, when the US dropped the gold standard, it needed the US dollar to remain the world's reserve currency. In order to do that, it persuaded Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states followed. It persuaded them to only sell their oil in US dollars. And that meant that countries from around the world, if they needed to buy energy from the Middle East, they had to hold a vast reserve of US dollars. All of those US dollars, as a result of selling oil in the Middle East, then went to the US financial system, where treasuries and investments were made in the stock market and so on. And that has benefited the US substantially since. In exchange for that deal, the US offered the Middle East security guarantees. And that system was called the petrodollar system. The Chinese equivalent is coming to be called the petroyuan system, which is somewhat related to BRICS, but that's another for another post. Now, as a result of the US and Israel attacking Iran, and the consequences that have unfolded, that the Gulf countries are realizing that the US is now unable to provide the security guarantees that were given in exchange for selling oil only in US dollars. And the fact that sanctions are speeding up the switch to US dollars. So Iran, for example, has been under some form of sanction since 1979. In order to sell its oil, it's had to do that below market prices, and the dominant buyer today is China. So it exchanges those its oil for yuan. Now, there are other reasons why countries are veering away from trading in US dollars. So the US economy is becoming an ever smaller part of GDP globally, relatively. More Middle East oil now goes to China and Asia, and the percentage of world trade that involves the US is under 20%. So, in summary, the deal that was offered by the Americans is now being offered by the Chinese. In summary, the reasons that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries the reason they agreed to sell their oil in US dollars, the reasons that they agreed to do that, the US was the dominant supplier, provided security guarantees and so on. Dominant buyer and provided security guarantees and so on. Those reasons are now being provided by China. And this will embed if Iran survives, and that survival is reinforced by China and Russia backing up Iran, because then we come on to the Middle Eastern energy supplies being a choke point, and whichever side is able to control those supplies is able to control the energy supplies going to countries and economies around the world, and therefore dictate their economic development. In other words, it has power over them.